What did grandparents eat when the fridge was almost empty and the paycheck was still a week away? What dishes helped to survive when there was no money but bread, a little fat, and a little imagination? These forgotten sandwiches weren't just food. They were a way to endure, maintain dignity, and feed a family. Simple ingredients were used to create flavors that seem strange today, but were once the norm. Each slice of bread generously spread with lard, mashed potatoes, or even plain sourdough was an essential element of daily survival. These sandwiches smelled like firewood, gritted their teeth from sugar, and were as warm as an old blanket. Behind them were whole eras: the Great Depression, the post-war years, rural poverty. But with them always came care, ingenuity, and the ability to enjoy even a crumb. Many of these flavors are forgotten today because the very need has disappeared. But in these recipes is a real story that cannot be blotted out. They are not just strange combinations. They are food that saved the day. It was made without recipes, by eye, with love, and from the last of the leftovers. They were sandwiches that helped us grow up, survive crises, and stay a family. Lard and Salt Sandwich. A thick slice of country bread, smeared with pork fat, was the basis for this modest but caloric dish. The lard was stoked on the stove and stored in a tin can. It served as a cooking fat, a spread, and a means of survival. In especially hard times, it replaced butter and meat. The top was sprinkled with salt, a little so as not to oversalt, but enough to awaken the flavor. Such a sandwich gave energy for the whole day. It was often eaten in the morning before hard work in the field or factory. Sometimes thinly sliced onion or garlic was added, but most often everything was limited to fat and salt. Bread was coarse with a thick crust, slightly toasted in a frying pan. Children didn't like it, but they ate it because there was no choice. It was warm and greasy, leaving a mark on their fingers. Its flavor was remembered for years, not because of the pleasure, but because of the power of the memories. The sandwich was accompanied by a cup of strong tea or just water. It was eaten quickly without talking. It was part of the daily ritual. There was something stark and honest about it. Such a sandwich was rarely served to guests. It was for one's own people, for those who knew what it meant to be in need. It was simple, heavy, and true. Sugar and butter sandwich. A thin slice of white bread was spread with butter and generously sprinkled with sugar. This sandwich was a true dessert of poverty. The butter was often salty, and combined with the sugar, it created a wonderful sense of luxury. It was popular with children, especially in the mornings. Sometimes it was put in the school lunch, wrapped in waxed paper. The cheapest bread was used, store-bought, with a soft crust and airy flesh. Such a sandwich melted in the mouth, especially if the butter melted a little. Sometimes a pinch of cinnamon was added on top for flavor. It was sweet, simple, and a little naughty. In the colder months, it was eaten with hot cocoa or milk. The butter had to be stretched, sometimes spread very thinly. But even a small amount made the sandwich delicious. It was a symbol of cozy, homely happiness in hard times. Some people added honey instead of sugar if they had access. But most often it was sugar and butter. The sugar crunched a little on the teeth, and the kids enjoyed it. Sometimes sandwiches were made ahead of time and served at potlucks. They were light but hearty. It was a dessert that didn't require an oven. Its taste brought a smile even on the grayest of days. Peanut butter and lard sandwich. This sandwich was born out of ingenuity. It combined two sources of energy, protein and fat. Peanut butter was spread on one side of the bread and melted pork fat on the other. The flavor was strange but rich. The salty fat contrasted with the thick, nutty flavor. Sometimes a little salt or honey was added. Such a sandwich was heavy, almost like meat. It was eaten by workers in construction and mines. It kept fresh for a long time and did not spoil without refrigeration. This was important in families without constant electricity. It was not served to children, it was for adults. It was believed to give strength and endurance. Such a sandwich was prepared quickly, without too much effort. Bread was used stale or toasted. It was crispy on the outside and greasy and stringy on the inside. It wasn't loved, but it was respected. It was the food of survival. It kept you warm in the cold and satiated you in the heat. Such a sandwich knew the value of labor and hunger. A bean sandwich from a can. Beans from a tin can, heated on the stove or directly on the fire, became the main stuffing. It was spooned onto bread, often toasted bread. Such a sandwich was hot, hearty, and flavorful. Beans often sizzled from the heat and smelled of smoked molasses. It was eaten with a spoon and fingers, dripping onto hands. The bread absorbed the juice, becoming soft and sticky. It was a simple but nutritious dinner. Sometimes a little ketchup or onion was added, rarely a slice of bacon, if there was any. Beans were cheap, stored for a long time, and saved families in hard times. They were bought by the crates in military supermarkets. Children begged for more, adults saved money. Such a sandwich was associated with army rations in camps. It was eaten with the window open. The smell was strong. It was the food of those who worked with their hands. Food without frills, but with dignity. Its flavor is firmly etched in the memory. The beans may have been sweet or salty, but bread was always the base. It made beans nourishing and comforting. Cabbage sandwich. Cabbage was first boiled or stewed with onions and spices. When there were leftovers, they were transferred to bread. Most often, it was stale bread, slightly toasted in a frying pan. The cabbage became soft, almost creamy. Sometimes it was seasoned with vinegar or mustard. This dish was especially popular in winter. Warm cabbage was warm and satiating. It was cheap, it was grown in vegetable gardens. A little black pepper or cumin was added. The cabbage was sliced coarsely so it wouldn't fall out. The sandwich was moist, a little spicy. It was eaten with hands, wrapped in paper. It was a version of a hot sandwich without meat. Sometimes mashed potatoes or eggs were added, but most of the time it was just cabbage. It was sour, homemade, rustic. It was eaten this way both in the cities and in the countryside. Its flavor was reminiscent of grandmother's cuisine, and even after decades it was not forgotten. Ketchup sandwich. When there was almost nothing left in the fridge, there was ketchup. It was spread directly on the bread, either thickly or in a thin layer. The flavor was sour, tomato, and pungent. Such a sandwich was eaten in a hurry, for breakfast or dinner. It was a salvation for mothers with several children. Sometimes it was toasted, turning it into hot toast. Children loved the bright color and taste. It reminded them of the hot dogs and pizza they couldn't afford. Sometimes salt or dried garlic was sprinkled on top. Bread was plain, white or gray. Ketchup was squeezed out of a glass bottle, slowly and with effort. Sometimes it was diluted with water so that there was enough for everyone. It was a sandwich of nothing, but there was ingenuity and hope in it. It wasn't shamed, it was eaten. It was often made in homes with lots of children. It was loud, it was red, it was simple. It was eaten in the kitchen, on the porch, in the yard. It was a food available to everyone, and everyone remembered it. Mashed potato sandwich. The leftover mashed potatoes from last night's dinner were put on bread. It was cold, dense with bits of potato. Sometimes gravy was dripped on top, if there was any left. A sandwich like that was heavy but reliable. It was eaten for breakfast or lunch. It took no time to cook. The mashed potatoes were spread with a spoon, flattened with a knife. Sometimes a little salt or butter was added. Bread was often rye or homemade. Such a sandwich was convenient to take with you. It resembled a pie but without a crust. It was eaten on the road, on construction sites, in the field. Sometimes it was served with salted cucumber or onions. It was a purely utilitarian food. It was cold, soft, and dense. Everything was saved on it except the potatoes. It was often eaten by teenagers, hearty and cheap. It had no flavor, only satiation. And yet it was still remembered as a part of real life. Egg and vinegar sandwich. Eggs were hard-boiled, cooled, peeled, and finely chopped. Sometimes they were crushed with a fork to a mush. A little vinegar, salt, and pepper were added. The result was a sour, savory mass. It was spooned onto the bread. Sometimes onions or mustard were added. It was similar to egg salad, but much simpler. The bread was dense, so it wouldn't get soggy. The sandwich was moist, a little spicy. It was eaten for lunch or dinner, sometimes served with soup. It went well with hot tea. Eggs were taken from the farm or bought by the piece. It was a quick way to feed a family. The mass was spread thickly so that there was enough for everyone. The taste was simple but recognizable. It was the sandwich a generation grew up with. It was eaten in school lunches and at home. It was part of the everyday table. Its recipe was passed down without words, just made the same way Mom and Grandma made it. Cornflake sandwich. Dry cornflakes were placed on a slice of buttered bread. It was one of the most unusual variations. Crunch, sweetness, and fat were combined in a strange harmony. It was the kind of sandwich the kids liked. Sometimes the cereal was slightly soaked with milk, but more often it remained crunchy. The bread used was white, fluffy, like a sponge. Butter had to be spread thickly to make the cereal stick. It was eaten for breakfast or at midday, sometimes sprinkled with sugar on top. A sandwich like this was ready in a minute. It didn't require cooking or utensils. It was a meal on the run. The flakes would fall on the floor, but no one complained. It was eaten by the TV or on the porch. It was childish, impractical, but memorable. Sometimes it had more cereal than bread. My parents thought it was empty, but allowed it as a rare treat. It was loud. Every bite crunched. And that was the sound of childhood. Banana and mayonnaise sandwich. A ripe banana was cut lengthwise and placed on bread, generously smeared with mayonnaise. The combination seemed strange, but it had a balance of sweetness and sourness. This sandwich was popular in the American South. It was eaten in school lunches and at home. Bananas were cheap and available year-round. The mayonnaise used was not homemade, but industrial with a distinctive flavor. Sometimes salad leaves were added to the sandwich. The bread was white, soft. The sandwich was sticky, sweet, and greasy. It satiated you quickly. Kids liked it better than adults. It was something between a dessert and an appetizer. Sometimes bananas were mashed with a fork and mixed with mayonnaise. It was served cold. It was eaten with milk or tea. This sandwich was controversial. Some people loved it, some hated it. But in hard times, it was a luxury, and its taste is hard to forget. It remains a symbol of a strange but real food from the past. Onion and mustard sandwich. The combination was simple, but so distinctive that it was remembered for years. A ring of raw onions, often red, sometimes yellow, was placed on a thick slice of white bread. On top was spread a thin layer of mustard, more often burning, grainy. Bread was used whatever was at hand, sometimes dried out, but still in use. It was a sandwich for those who were not afraid of the smell and needed something invigorating. The mustard stung the lips, the onions were crunchy, and it was more invigorating than coffee. A sandwich like this was often eaten before work or after a hard day's work. There was no time to cook it, but it came together in seconds. Sometimes salt was added, sometimes a little vinegar. Surprisingly, the flavor was bright and stayed on the tongue for a long time. The odor, of course, was also strong and stayed in the kitchen for a long time. In some families, it was almost a ritual. My father would make such a sandwich, eat it in silence, and look out the window. Grandmothers used to say that it was an honest sandwich, unadorned. Sometimes onions were replaced with green onions, especially in spring. They used whatever mustard was in the refrigerator, be it spicy German or simple American. Children were not allowed to eat such sandwiches. The flavor was too strong, but teenagers sooner or later tried it, got into it, and ate it with pleasure. It required no cooking or effort, perfect in the shortage of everything. When the bread ran out, mustard was spread simply on an onion. Even today, some remember this sandwich with reverence. He was humble, but not without character. Macaroni and cheese sandwich. The leftover mac and cheese from dinner was never thrown away. It was simply put between two slices of bread and eaten at lunch or breakfast. The sandwich was heavy and gooey, but hearty and filling. Sometimes the pasta was heated first, but more often it was put straight on cold. The warm bread absorbed the cheese sauce, becoming soft and flavorful. It was a frugal solution when food was scarce. It was the kind of sandwich they gave to children at school, wrapped in wax paper. It was strangely delicious. Starch plus starch, cheese plus gluten. Sometimes they put a circle of boiled sausage on top for extra luxury. Inside the pasta could be spirals, shells, or regular cones. Cheese, as a rule, was powdered from a box, but children were not embarrassed by it. Everything was blended into one thick, comforting whole. Such a sandwich was eaten slowly. It satiated for a long time. In those years, they used to say, the main thing was to be warm and nourishing. It was not sold in cafes or served to guests. It was homemade. Sometimes a little butter was added to the bread to make it softer. In other cases, mac and cheese was squeezed between toasts and fried on a griddle. Then the crust would become crispy and the middle would become molten. It was a sign of poverty, but it was also a sign of ingenuity. People who grew up on it remembered it with warmth and a slight irony. Canned stew sandwich. The Spam can was in almost every home, especially in the 40s and 50s, but people still bought it in the 70s. It opened with a distinctive sound. The threaded metal strip crumbled under your fingers. Inside came out a fat, shiny block of pinkish meat. It was cut into slices and immediately put on bread, sometimes fried, sometimes eaten cold. The flavor was salty, slightly spicy, but the main thing was that it was rich and did not spoil for a long time. Such a sandwich was considered a festive option, especially when meat was rare in the diet. Most often, the bread was white and slightly dried. Sometimes a little mustard or a drop of ketchup was added to enhance the flavor. In some families, Spam was heated on a griddle until crispy, and then it became almost like bacon. Children didn't always like it, but they ate it because there was no other. Stew was a product of the era of war and poverty, and remained a reminder of them. It could be stored for months and was always on hand. Sometimes a piece of Spam was simply placed on a saltine cracker, but the bread sandwich was the main meal. Adding a pickle made the flavor more interesting, and that recipe was passed on. Some sprinkled black pepper on the meat, others grated a little onion on top. This sandwich was often taken to work or on the road. It didn't need refrigeration. Surprisingly, Spam still exists, and some people find it nostalgic. Its taste is impossible to forget. It is recognizable from the first bite. It is not a gourmet dish, but a piece of survival and sustainability. For many families, it was a symbol that even in hard times you can feed the whole family. Apple and cinnamon sandwich. Sweet but not cloying, this sandwich was something between a dessert and a snack. Apples were thinly sliced, placed on buttered bread, and sprinkled generously with cinnamon. Sometimes sugar was added, but more often they relied on the sweetness of the fruit. Apples were taken any kind, green, red, whatever was at hand. Bread could be both white and rye, depending on what was left in the house. Butter made the scraps soft and a little stretchy, especially if it was warm. In cold winters, this sandwich seemed especially cozy. It didn't require an oven or mixer. Everything you needed was in the kitchen. Apples were sometimes pre-baked or roasted if you had access to a stove. In the summertime, fresh fruit from the vegetable garden or a neighbor's garden was used. Cinnamon was cheap but added a flavor of richness and warmth. Such a sandwich could be given to a child after school or eaten in the evening with tea. Sometimes it even appeared on the table for breakfast with a drop of honey on top. In some families, such sandwiches were made on homemade bread. The aroma was all over the kitchen. It was an option for those who wanted sweets but couldn't afford baked goods. Children ate it with pleasure, especially if the apples were sour. Some used margarine instead of butter. It's cheaper but still tasty. The sandwich was simple, but it had character, and it was hard to forget. It combined seasonal gifts with everyday ingenuity. It wasn't luxurious, but it made you feel cozy and warm, even in tough times. Sandwich with milk gravy and black pepper. A hot slice of white bread generously drizzled with a thick white gravy made with milk and black pepper. This gravy was made from flour, milk, and a drop of fat left after frying anything. Sometimes fried onions or pieces of dried meat were added, if there were any. The bread would get wet from the gravy and the edges would remain slightly crispy. It was a dish from school canteens and army breakfasts, which later spread to home kitchens. The gravy was cooked right in the skillet where bacon or sausage had been fried before. Black pepper was not spared. It gave the necessary sharpness. Such a sandwich was eaten with a spoon in hands. It was warm, hearty, and inexpensive. It was often prepared for breakfast or dinner when there was no food or strength left for a full meal. Yesterday's bread was used. It held its shape better in the gravy. Children thought it was too spicy, but adults appreciated it for its flavor and simplicity. This dish often appeared on the table during the cold season, especially in the Midwest. In the South, a pinch of nutmeg was added to the gravy. Sometimes the sandwich was accompanied by a pickle or half a hard-boiled egg. Gravy was often made by eye without a recipe, focusing on consistency. The thickness varied. Some made it almost like a sauce, others like a thick porridge. The sandwich was often eaten standing at the stove or right over the sink. It was a meal without unnecessary ceremony, with soul and warmth. It left a feeling of comfort and fullness, even if there was nothing else in the house. Overcooked cabbage sandwich. On a thick slice of rye or white bread was laid cabbage, fried with onions and fat until golden. Sometimes cabbage was sour, then the flavor was sharp and rich. In other cases, fresh white cabbage was used, shredded and fried until soft. Lard, butter, or margarine was used as fat, whatever was at hand. Onions were added for sweetness and flavor, sometimes with carrots. The sandwich was served hot, and a spoonful of sour cream or a drop of vinegar could go on top. This dish was often eaten in winter when cabbage was one of the few vegetables available. Cabbage was stewed in large pans or pots, and there was enough leftovers to last several days. Bread was toasted in the same pan to soak up the flavor. The hot stuffing warmed the bread, and it became soft and flavorful. Such a sandwich was served for lunch or dinner, especially when there was no meat. Sometimes a little rice was added to the cabbage to increase the volume. It was a way to feed many mouths from a small amount of ingredients. Children didn't always like it, but adults appreciated it for its richness. The sandwich was eaten with hands or with a knife and fork, depending on the degree of friedness. The crunch of the fried cabbage and the sweetness of the onions created a cozy, recognizable taste. In some homes, this dish was considered a winter delicacy. It symbolized the resilience and frugality of generations. This sandwich was passed down in stories as part of a family kitchen that survived against all odds. Baked bean and onion sandwich. Warm baked beans from a can were generously placed on a toasted piece of white bread. Often they would put a slice of raw onion on top for sharpness. The beans were in a sweet sauce, thick, sticky, flavored with tomato, sugar, and spices. Sometimes it was heated on the stove, but more often it was just reheated in the microwave or eaten cold. This kind of sandwich was a teenage favorite because it could be assembled in a minute. The onions made the flavor less cloying and gave it a grown-up food feel. Variations included adding ketchup, mustard, or even a drop of vinegar. Bread was chosen to hold the weight of the beans. Often it was leftovers from dinner, some beans and a couple of slices of bread. Sometimes they put a little grated cheese on the bread, if there was even a piece in the house. Beans were cheap but hearty, and they kept for a long time in the pantry. Many people remembered the taste for a lifetime. Simple but strangely comforting. Sometimes beans were pre-stewed with bacon or onion slices, but this was considered a festive version. Onions could be white or red, whatever was at hand. Some families spread butter on the bread and then put beans on it. Such a sandwich was often eaten standing up, without leaving the stove. It satisfied hunger for a long time, thanks to protein and carbohydrates. The flavor was soft and tangy, with unexpected bursts of sweetness or sourness. This sandwich was considered a lazy dinner when you didn't have the energy for anything else. It was born out of necessity, but over time it became a kind of homemade comfort food. Flour and water sandwich. The sandwich was not so much a meal as a desperate way to satisfy hunger. Flour was mixed with water to make a paste and spread on bread. Sometimes the mixture was slightly salted, or a spoonful of sugar was added if a sweet version was desired. The result was a thick, sticky mass with a floury flavor. In wartime or during the Great Depression, it was one of the most affordable ways to get full. They used the simplest white flour, which was bought by the bagful. The bread was usually homemade, coarse, often already stale. Sometimes this mixture was heated slightly to make it warm and a little more flavorful. In other cases, the flour was fried on a dry pan. Then the sandwich turned out with a nutty flavor. Such spread was given a meaning. It was said to hold the stomach. To children, this flavor seemed strange, but in the conditions of hunger, no one was picky. Flour sandwiches were eaten for breakfast or lunch, often with tea or just water. It was a meal of nothing, but it left a feeling of satiety. Sometimes a spoonful of lard was added to the paste, if possible. There were cases when such a mass was baked directly on bread, like a simple cake. This recipe was passed down not for love of flavor, but as a reminder of survival. It was part of the collective memory of poor neighborhoods. Today it is all but forgotten, but it once helped entire families survive. It was bread with bread and flour in between. Pea and mint sandwich. Boiled green peas were mashed with a fork until mashed. A pinch of salt, a little vinegar, and chopped fresh mint were added. It was a refreshing and hearty combination, especially in the summer. The mint overpowered the starchy flavor and added a slight coolness. The bread used was rye or white, but most often whatever was on hand. Sometimes canned or frozen peas were used instead of fresh peas. The pea layer was applied generously, spreading it all over the surface. Such a sandwich was like a vegetarian pâté. It was eaten as an independent dish or as an appetizer. In families that didn't eat meat every day, it was a source of protein. Variations included adding a dash of lemon juice or olive oil. Sometimes cumin or dill was used instead of mint. Everything was done by hand. No blender, just a spoon or fork. Peas were cheap and nutritious and were bought by the bagful. In summertime, such a sandwich was taken with you in the field or on the road. It did not require storage in the refrigerator and did not spoil for a long time. It tasted unexpectedly bright, with a note of freshness and earth. It was loved by children and the elderly, a simple food that did not require chewing. In some areas, a little sour cream was added to the mixture. It was both rustic and refined in feel. A sandwich with sourdough and sugar. White bread was cut into thick slices so that it would not fall apart under the wet mass. The sour milk was poured directly onto the bread with a spoon, like a sauce. The top was sprinkled with sugar, brown or ordinary white. All this was eaten at once. While the bread was still wet, the sour milk gave a sour taste, sugar, the necessary sweetness. It was a dessert from nothing, invented in poor families. It was often given to children before bedtime as a substitute for liver. Prostokvasha was prepared at home, leaving the milk in a warm place overnight. Sugar was dosed by eye. Some liked it sweeter, others barely sprinkled. Sometimes a drop of vanilla or cinnamon was added to the sourdough. Bread was chosen so that it would not crumble too much. The flavor was delicate, with a texture reminiscent of pudding. This dish was popular in the southern and midwestern states. It required no cooking. Everything was mixed in a minute. Cold sourdough was especially refreshing in the summer. It was eaten with a spoon if the sandwich was too wet. Sometimes a few fresh berries were added if there was a harvest. It was a treat of nothing, but many remembered it with warmth. The simplicity of the dish made it versatile. It was suitable for breakfast and dinner. Some families even ate cornbread this way for a special flavor. The meat sandwich from Sunday dinner. If there was a piece of roast left over from Sunday dinner, it was carefully sliced for sandwiches. Most often it was beef or ham, less often chicken. Slices of meat were put between the bread. Sometimes a little gravy was added. The sandwich was eaten cold without heating, straight from the refrigerator. It was a kind of reward on Monday, the rest of the holiday. The bread used was yesterday's bread, but lightly toasted on a frying pan. Sometimes mustard, ketchup, or pickle was added to the sandwich. If there were leftover mashed potatoes, they were also put inside. All this was wrapped in wax paper and taken to work. School children were envious of such a sandwich. It was almost like a meal from a restaurant. There was rarely any meat left, so the sandwich was considered a value. It was eaten slowly, savoring each bite. Variations included roast turkey with cranberry sauce or beef and onions. A sandwich like this told the story of how the family spent the weekend. It was homey comfort packed into the bread. Even dry meat got a second life in a sandwich. Sometimes it was warmed in a pan with bread. It made a warm sandwich. The smell of the roast still lingered when it was taken out of the bag. It was a way of prolonging a good thing, if only for one meal. It symbolized generosity and caring, even if it was only a couple of bites of meat. Baked potato and mustard sandwich. The potatoes were baked in the oven or directly in the coals, and then the flesh was crushed with a spoon. This hot, flavorful mass was spread on wheat or rye bread. Mustard was generously smeared on top. Spicy, sometimes grainy. The flavor was rich, warm, and slightly smoky. The mustard added the necessary spice so that the potatoes did not seem too bland. Such a sandwich was eaten hot until the potatoes cooled. Sometimes a little oil or a drop of vinegar was added. In poorer homes, it was a staple lunch or dinner. It was eaten by the stove, burning from the tuber that had just been taken out. The smell of potatoes and bread was an everyday part of the kitchen. Often, such a sandwich was made in winter, hearty and warming. Potatoes were taken large enough for 2 sandwiches. Sometimes onions or grated carrots were added to it, if there was any. This sandwich was given to children before school, wrapped in paper. The mustard helped keep hunger at bay for a long time. It was a country dish, but they made it in the cities too. The simplicity of the combination made it popular for generations. It was cheaper than any meat dish and left a feeling of satiety for a long time. There were traces of ash left on the baked potato crust. This gave it a smoky flavor. This sandwich was a hot reminder of home. Sometimes it was supplemented with slices of pickles or a drop of sour cream to dilute the spice. Many people recalled that this sandwich warmed cold winter evenings and helped to regain strength after a long day's work. By eating it, people felt connected to the land and traditions that sustained them through difficult times. Even years later, this simple sandwich remained a symbol of survival and family comfort. Corn and butter sandwich. Sweet corn from dinner was not thrown away. It was saved for the morning sandwiches. The kernels were carefully cut off the cob and placed on toasted bread. A piece of butter was placed on top to melt it. The result was a juicy, buttery sandwich with a bright flavor. Sometimes the corn was salted a little or a pinch of sugar was added. Such a sandwich was eaten for breakfast when you didn't want porridge. Bread was chosen to be toasted with a crispy crust. Corn was cheap and available, especially in the summer. In some houses, it was pre-fried with onions. The flavor was both sweet and salty, warm and buttery. The sandwich was eaten with a spoon if there were too many grains. It was the breakfast of farmers and laborers, quick and nutritious. Sometimes a drop of honey was added to the butter for extra softness. It was cooked for children and adults alike, a universal dish. Corn was easily digested and well stored. Such a sandwich smelled like summer, even if it was raining outside. Sometimes it was served with a mug of milk or coffee. It was one of those recipes that you didn't write down. You just did it. It required no effort, but it gave comfort and a taste of warmth. Even leftover corn was not wasted. Every spoonful went to work. This simple breakfast was a reminder of care passed down from generation to generation and became a small holiday in an ordinary day. In it lived the history of the family and the strength of traditions that survived against all odds. These sandwiches are not just food, but a whole story, encapsulated in slices of bread and simple fillings. They reflect a time when every bite was worth its weight in gold, and ingenuity and the ability to make a lot out of a little became an art form. These recipes tell the story of how families kept each other warm and caring despite hardships. Each sandwich is a memory of those who never gave up and found strength in the simplest things to feed loved ones. Today, many of these flavors are forgotten, but it is important to remember them, not to bring back the need, but to respect the past and understand how strong our ancestors were. These recipes teach you to appreciate what you have and find joy in the simple. By subscribing to the channel, you are helping to preserve this unique cultural memory so that it does not fade into oblivion, but continues to inspire and remind us of the strength of spirit and family traditions. Together, we can preserve and tell these stories to new generations.